On a Saturday afternoon. We're going to be talking about APES Unit 1 and 2 today. So please make sure that you join the Pear Deck so that you're able to answer those great questions and be able to get those questions back to you at the end of our session. So if you go to joinpd.com and put in the code KPXGWH, I see 7 of you guys have already joined. That's great. And then we will get started. So I'm going to give you about 10, 15 more seconds to get that set up, and then we will begin. All right, 8, 9, excellent. All right, so I'm going to start, but you can always join. The code should still be in one of the corners, or if you need help, just let me know at any point during the presentation if you want to join that. So I will be sharing my screen with the presentation on it the entire time. So when it comes to a slide where you have a question in Pear Deck, you'll just need to sort of reopen your browser where you have Pear Deck open, and then just answer the question there, or you could have them open side by side or toggle between, whichever you would like to do. All right, so like I said, we'll be talking about APES Unit 1 and 2 today. Those 2 units are lengthy. There's a lot of great background information in it, and it's all about the living world. So before we begin, here's what I would hope you can be able to do after this review. So basically what is going to be expected from you on the AP exam on the content in these 2 units. Well, the first thing is you've got to be able to explain how the chemical and physical aspects of ecosystems interact, and then how human activity can possibly affect those interactions. And you've probably been learning a lot of that recently with the past couple of units that you've probably done. The second thing is to explain how ecosystem dynamics determine the flow of energy through organisms. That's going to be our food webs, our food chains, trophic structure. You also want to be able to describe how these chemical and physical interactions shape the biodiversity of communities. So why are some communities more biodiverse? Is that because of greater amounts of nutrients, energy coming in and out? And the last thing is you want to be able to relate back how humans benefit from having high biodiversity, meaning why is it important for humans to want to preserve or conserve these areas of biodiversity. So before we kind of go any further, how are you guys kind of feeling about these topics or your ability to do that? Okay, so I see a lot of happy faces, a lot of good stuff. And then maybe not so much, but that's great because that is why we are here. So if you can do this stuff after this, then that will be a win. All right. So the first thing that we have to really talk about here are the levels of organization within the entire biosphere, right? So each time that you get a question in the AP exam, it's going to be related to one of these levels of structure. So first of all, let's see if you guys are familiar with what these are. So if you could take a guess at what you think 1 is, what is 2, 3, 4, and then lastly, 5. All right, excellent. So far, everybody's correct on the first level, which are the global processes. You've got it. It's the biosphere. That's correct on that second level as well. Shelby, that's looking great. Jordan, I'm glad you brought up niches. We're going to be talking about that. Yeah, that's perfect. So, one, you've got biosphere. Two, we've got the ecosystem, which is where we take all the living things and we're really considering how energy is cycling through and also nutrients. Three, you are correct. That is communities where you have interacting populations. Four, of course, are going to be populations made out of a single species. And then five, everybody, it looks like correct. That is the individual or the organism level. So, kind of your job in this review will be connecting all of these levels of organization to human impacts, biodiversity, and maybe why some communities look different from others. All right, great job so far, guys. So I'm sure you know, Earth has about four major components that support all of the biosphere: the atmosphere, hydrosphere, geosphere, and biosphere. I highly encourage you when you are writing on free response questions to begin using these terms to describe things that might be happening in those spheres. So when you've talked about air pollution, that's atmospheric, and then you have various different levels, right? Geosphere, that's all about weathering, erosion, that plate tectonic stuff that you talked about in Unit 4. So it's really important to be able to name the level of Earth that you're talking about in your free response question. And like I said before, this is sort of foundational to everything else that we'll start talking about. So just a quick review: three factors within all of these spheres that help to sustain Earth's life. One is the one-way flow of high quality energy from the sun through living things. So that's a one-way street. Two is the cycling of nutrients through parts of the biosphere that are going to be abiotic and both biotic. And then three, of course, gravity. That allows the planet to hold its atmosphere and really propels everything else within these different cycles. Now, one of the important things when it comes to considering the energy dynamics globally is the way that the Earth's tilted axis causes seasonal shifts for some latitudes. This is going to be important later when we talk about what causes areas to be more biodiverse, or why might there be more productivity in one area versus another, or why do we see the different evolutionary pressures in one area versus another. So where we are right now is a temperate area. That means that we experience part of the year where there's more sun, there's more sunlight, more heat, and then part of the year where it's not. So summer, winter, spring and fall are the in-between transition periods for that. Other places, though, may not have this a seasonal shift, and that's going to be around the equator. Now, how does this affect behavior of populations and communities? Well, one major thing that we'll talk about later are migratory patterns. So if you have shifting amounts of energy from the north hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, and you have populations of organisms that require a certain type of breeding environment or a certain amount of energy, then they may have to migrate to those places in order to access those resources. So one thing that's really important here is to also talk about sun angle when it controls sunlight intensity. And I'll bring this up later when we talk about biome distribution. So here is the equator region right here. And remember, there really isn't any kind of seasonal shift here. Most of the year, if not all of the year, the sun is directly overhead. So it's going to really be the most productive areas of Earth, the most biomass, because of course you have the most energy from the sun. In northern latitudes here, some parts of the year, even if the sun is out all day, even if it's clear, sunny, there's no cloud cover, the sunlight is still being filtered through layers of the atmosphere here. So that means that you're not getting as much heat or radiation light to heat these surfaces as effectively, even if it feels sunny outside. So this is definitely going to change all of the ways that populations behave and the different evolutionary pressures that these areas experience. Okay, so I've kind of been talking about sunlight, movement of energy, movement of materials. But one important thing is to be able to connect that with whether or not these components are abiotic or non-living versus biotic. So living components effects on the ecosystem or community dynamics change with their density and distribution, whereas abiotic factors aren't, but are often the limiting aspects of a lot of things like food chains, productivity. So really quick, you guys tell me what you know about some abiotic and biotic factors. Yeah, temperature and precipitation, that's perfect. Those are very important abiotic factors. Sunlight, absolutely, that's abiotic. Water availability, that's abiotic, so that would be precipitation. Atmospheric conditions, absolutely. Wind, those are abiotic. Any biotic factors? That's true. Biotic factors are going to be related to living organisms like animals and plants. Absolutely. Perfect. A biotic factor is population density. Yes. Right. Overhunting or even predation. That's perfect for a biotic factor. Some natural disasters are absolutely abiotic. I think you're getting to like fire, tornadoes, hurricanes. All right, excellent job, guys. So right here, I've got a diagram of a population of fish. Oh, and then I moved it, of course. And this population of fish has what we call a optimal range of all of these factors. So some of you guys mentioned sunlight, right? Some of you guys are talking about water. Well, in aquatic systems, things like nutrient content, salinity, pH, those are all abiotic factors that can affect the distribution of populations and what can really be sustained there. So in general, when we have a community or a population, individuals will have a area where their optimal functioning exists. And then you're going to have some lower or higher amounts of those factors, like a little bit lower salinity, a little bit higher salinity. And some individuals are going to be able to tolerate that. But then you've got zones of intolerance where the factor has shifted either to one extreme or the other, and there can be no optimal functioning of that population. So in environmental science, oftentimes when we talk about ecosystem change or human impacts, we're really talking about what have we done to the ecosystem to drive the factor into this zone of intolerance, and how does the population respond? Okay, so just to review, abiotic, you've got temperature, sunlight, wind. Biotic, some of you guys talked about predation. Think about it. As you have more individuals in the population, you're also going to have more predation stress or pressure. So more individuals have to have to eat, so they consume more prey. If you have less predators, they consume less. So that's what it means by these factors change in their intensity with the density. Okay, so all of these abiotic and biotic factors are going to mostly determine things like the location of biomes. And more importantly for terrestrial biomes, this is going to be temperature and precipitation. So if we look at the distribution of these biomes, we can see that the tropical types are right around here with the equator, right? So we've got tropical grassland or savanna located here, here, also here on the edge of that tropical zone. And then we've also got the tropical forest here in this lighter green that's here, here, also over here on the equator. Why is that? Well, there's a lot of sunlight and probably a lot of precipitation in these areas. As we move north and south away from this tropical area, we get into the temperate zone. So temperate forests, temperate grasslands. But if you notice, there's also some interspersing of a different type of biome here that isn't really related to latitude, and that is mountains or alpine regions. That's an altitude thing. So the higher you go, it doesn't matter at what latitude these biomes are found at, that is what they are going to look, that's what they're going to look like. So one thing, and I'll show you an example question soon, is I want you to remember sort of what are the degrees here with the equator. So the equator, of course, is 0. And then you've got the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn that are sort of like these outer boundaries of the tropical region. Those occur around 24, 25 degrees. And then here, just for reference, this is us. Well, this is me. I'm in Birmingham. So Birmingham's latitude is 33.5 degrees north. So that's definitely a temperate latitude. So looking at this diagram here, where we can see that as we decrease precipitation, there's a shift to drier biomes. And then as we also decrease temperature, there's a shift towards cooler biomes where you've got, really cool and dry, really hot but really dry, really cool but very wet. So where on earth do you think that you would find, speaking of latitude, the biome of chaparral, right? So right here, kind of in the middle, I think we also call this scrubland. Where would that be? Where would the tropical grasslands or savanna be? What about the coniferous forest? Yeah, savannas around the equator, absolutely. Chaparral, yeah, you're going to find those in dry areas, absolutely. So maybe some places in Nevada, Arizona. Yeah, the West Coast in Australia absolutely has chaparral. Very good. Yeah, 30-ish degrees. I like that. Yeah, areas with very little rainfall. That would absolutely be where you would see maybe a little bit more tropical grassland instead of a tropical rainforest. Yeah, coniferous forest, going to be northern United States, absolutely. Yeah, Australia has some chaparral biomes. Yeah, the Mediterranean, absolutely. All right, good job. So what I want you guys to take away from this is not necessarily that you have to really memorize a map of all of the biomes, but it's a good idea to kind of understand how does latitude affect whether or not there's going to be a lot of heat year round or a lot of rainfall. Okay. So one thing that the last thing I'll talk about here is also how disturbances will relate back to biome abiotic conditions. So of all of these different biomes, the forests that are going to be at most danger of something like forest fires and other types of things are going to be over here, right? Where it's really dry. You have decreasing precipitation, but you actually still have some biomass there that can catch fire. It's going to be kind of hard for the rainforest to experience extensive forest fires without something really drastically changing. So keep that in mind when we get to natural disturbances later. Now, aquatic biomes are determined by slightly different abiotic factors. These are going to be things that affect the quality of the water more so than whether or not there's like precipitation or temperature. So important things to remember is the water clear or is it very turbid? That's going to really limit the amount of sunlight for photosynthesis. So clearer water, it can penetrate deeper, more photosynthesis possibly. Other things like the availability of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and we'll talk about those biogeochemical cycles in a while, that is going to be important for primary productivity of these aquatic areas. And then often things like salinity and temperature are stratified, meaning if you have a really deep aquatic biome, say a deep lake or the ocean or something like that, there's oftentimes these layers where at the very top it might be very hot and then at the very bottom it might be cool. So having these stratified characteristic of a biome allows certain organisms to live there and then others to be in a different place. Now, one last thing that's really, really important about aquatic biomes is this idea of dissolved oxygen. So just because organisms are aquatic does not mean that they don't require O2 for cellular respiration. They absolutely do. So when we look at biodiversity numbers in an aquatic system, the more the dissolved oxygen there is, we typically see a greater amount of biodiversity, meaning that aquatic biome has enough oxygen to support a variety of different species, some that are oxygen demanding and others that are not. So one really good indicator of poor water quality or a threatened aquatic biome is if you test the water and there's low dissolved oxygen. Okay. So now that we've kind of talked a little bit about biomes and you remember a little bit about that, let's kind of practice with a question that you could see on the AP exam. So there's two parts to this. One, you want to describe the air temperature range for a boreal forest, also known as a coniferous forest. And then based on this graph, identify the major grassland present within 20 degrees north and south of the equator. All right, give you guys a few more seconds to get your answers in. All right, yeah, I think most of you guys are doing well on this, picking up on what you need to get from this graph. So for number one, we're looking at the air temperature range. So this can be a little bit, throw you off for a second. So if you get a question on the exam that has a graph here, just make sure that we're really looking in on our axes. So on the x-axis, we've got precipitation, which would be moisture. And then here we've got the air temperature on the y-axis. So it kind of relates these two variables. So when we're looking at the air temperature range here, this is the boreal forest. So, if we kind of draw a line about here, that's the top range. And then here's the bottom range. So that's about from -5 to about 6 degrees Celsius. So if you said B, you are correct. So the second question here is talking about within 20 degrees of north and south. So remember, that's well within that tropical region. And we know in tropical areas around the equator, where we may have low or we may have high precipitation, but we absolutely are going to have pretty steady high temperatures. And then it also said grassland. So of all the things that are here, you know, desert's not a grassland, neither is the dry forest or the wet forest. So if you said savanna, you are correct. Okay, so let's kind of shift our conversation away from sort of these abiotic factors and talk about how biome distribution really affects the types of communities and ecosystems that can exist there. So remember, communities and ecosystems are also different levels in that levels of organization. And what we're going to find out later here is that these ecosystems can be made of multiple different types of habitats. And the more habitats that you have, the greater the variety of the ecosystem. Generally, that means that we've got greater biodiversity. More things can be sustained in those different niches. So for instance, I've got an example here for the African and Asian elephant habitats. So you can see it's pretty wide range. I mean, they live pretty much everywhere that there's biomass to eat in on the African continent and here. But look at the different types of habitats we have. We've got savanna, we've got vegetation that's all different. There are some forest areas that they can be, and they are distributed widely, right? So many different species are able to live in a variety of these different habitats within a biome. Another important thing that will come up later, especially when we look at soil and stratification of soil or maybe smaller biomes, are things that are called microhabitats. So microhabitats are an even smaller part of habitat that possesses a very specific physical or chemical condition that allows one particular type of organism to thrive. So these can vary greatly in things like light, temperature, humidity, and air circulation. That is wildly different from those abiotic factors in the rest of the habitat. So for instance, here I've got this kind of like algae moss bit on the top of bark here. So whereas maybe the air temperature surrounding this bark may be higher, it's probably going to be a little cooler here in these crevices. It's also going to be able to maintain more moisture. So this is a microhabitat that's conducive to the formation of this particular type of moss or this particular type of lichen. So when there are human activities within a habitat, not only does it affect the larger habitat, but it could also disrupt things like microhabitats. So somebody brought up niche earlier, and I'm glad that it was brought up because oftentimes it's confused with habitat, right? So a habitat is just a particular area of an ecosystem where organisms can live. But a niche is a little bit different. This more describes the role the organism has within the habitat. So here I've got this example of different types of warblers, and you can see that they're very similar species. I mean, they're all warblers, and they live in this same kind of like coniferous looking tree here. But notice that they only occupy very specific layers of the tree. This warbler species here lives lower on the tree and in a more interior area. These two are higher up, but they live, they have slightly overlapping niches. And then these here are towards the middle of the tree on the interior. So what we normally see with a niche here is that this allows multiple different organisms to be in the same habitat without having extreme competition over the same resources. More on that a little bit later. One of the other things we'll talk about in Unit 2 is the idea of a keystone species, which oftentimes otters are used on the AP exam as an example of a keystone species. These types of species have a very important niche because their functional role in the habitat is so important to the biodiversity that if they were to be removed, they have a negative impact on the abundance of other species. So typically you see a decrease in a keystone species population, you're also going to see a decrease in biodiversity. One thing that you might see as well is the difference between a fundamental niche and then a realized niche, meaning, like, let me go back here, meaning, is it possible for this myrtle warbler to probably be able to live everywhere in that tree? Absolutely. But in the presence of all of these other species, that kind of distribution is limited. So the realized niche is where the organism actually occupies, but oftentimes they've got a wider range that they can exist in. And this goes back to that idea of range of tolerance that we talked about earlier. So maybe this type of barnacle here, I mean, it could live at this entire distribution along this rocky kind of outcrop, but you've got a biotic condition here, which is competition, which separates those niches. All right, we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit and talk more about energy and matter as it cycles through the ecosystem. I hope that you guys are really familiar with this particular diagram. If not, I think this slide here would be a great thing to kind of like study to get a good idea of the difference in the similarities between chemical and energy cycling and flow. So we're going to talk about these biogeochemical cycles in a minute, but I also want to kind of touch on one difference that we're seeing here. The red arrows, this is our energy, right? And you can see it's moving up, it's going to the decaying material. It's also being moved back and forth between microorganisms and detritivores. But you can also see that at every exchange, at every point where energy is moving between levels, a little bit is being left, a little bit's being lost from the system. So it doesn't completely cycle, but these blue arrows here, nothing is lost, everything is kept. It just keeps going in a circle and a circle and a circle. So if you're ever asked to maybe compare or contrast or describe the difference between energy and matter in an ecosystem, energy is a one-way street, whereas matter continuously cycles. The other important part that we'll get to with energy flow is the laws of thermodynamics. I rarely encourage people to just strictly memorize things in apes. I think it's much more important for you to kind of get a concept. But this is something that I think is worth just committing to memory. What is the first law and what is the second law of thermodynamics? And be able to sort of like write them out on a free response question. So the first law, of course, is conservation, meaning that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only converted. So where that's going to come back later is how energy moves from one trophic level to another. But within these exchanges, we have a transformation from highly usable, high quality energy to less usable or low quality energy. And we typically call this like entropy or disorder of the system, always increasing. But where we see this within the food chain, of course, is heat. Not to say that organisms don't need heat or that heat isn't a useful type of energy. Of course, we burn fossil fuels to heat our homes. But as far as being able to collect that heat and then do something useful with it later, that's not typically the case. Okay, so before we get into biogeochemical cycles, I kind of want to see what you guys already know. So here's a practice question for your response, two specific parts of it. And it's talking about the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle. So I'm going to give you a second to read that and then respond. Trinity, that's looking good. Mackenzie, yeah, that's great. John, Kaylee, excellent. All right, so you guys must have just finished up the air pollution unit. Excellent. Elizabeth, yeah, that's a good human impact. Yeah, Mackenzie, that's good. Brandon, yeah, those are good human impacts. All right, yeah, it looks like you guys definitely just came off of that air pollution unit, which is great. Looks like y'all remembered a lot of good stuff. I know that most of the climate change you guys are talking about, that's in the last unit. So hopefully y'all are getting to that or you're kind of getting there at least. Okay, so yeah, this is looking great. Now, the reason why I chose this practice question was really to demonstrate to you how you're going to have to talk about these biogeochemical cycles on the exam. There will be some questions that want you to talk about like a specific exchange, like, you know, nitrogen fixation or carbon like combustion or something like that. But in general, there's a few things that you're always going to have to know about each of these cycles. So real quick, I know some of you were still a little bit writing your answers, but I do want to show you the answers here. So if you identified a nitrogen or phosphorus compound, so you could have talked about nitrates. You could have talked about, a lot of you guys talked about nitrous oxides or NO2, talking about the reaction with VOCs that make photochemical smog. All of that was great. You also could have talked about the results of releasing this compound. So if you did talk about like nitrates or phosphates, that's going to be usually released with runoff when we fertilize our crops or yards or anything like that. But then for the last part there, with part B, this was talking about the cycling of carbon and then major environmental consequences of that. Most of you guys did talk about things like deforestation, burning of fossil fuels. That is what you want to do on these free response questions. Just saying, will humans release excess carbon? That's true. But if you notice, they really want you to describe what is the human activity that's doing this. So you want to be as specific as possible, especially when it comes to the burning of fossil fuels. So even saying something like using fossil fuels may not be specific enough for you to get that point on the exam. Combustion, burning, releasing CO2 from burning fossil fuels. That's where you really want to be. Okay. One other thing I do want to kind of point out here is this idea of acid rain, whereas ocean acidification. Now that's absolutely because of things like excess CO2. But when we're talking about acid rain, remember that is about sulfur or nitrogen that is released after we combust things like coal in coal burning power plants. So just make sure not to relate the ocean acidification, which is carbon, to acid rain, which is typically sulfur and nitrogen. So like I was saying, 3 things you got to do for these biogeochemical cycles. Number 1, you got to know what nutrients, why are they needed? So why do we need phosphorus? Why do we need nitrogen? You also need to know what are the processes within each of the cycles and then what organisms perform them. So what organisms are responsible for fixing carbon? What decompose nitrates? Is there anything happening with phosphorus, and of course, carbon dioxide with cellular respiration and photosynthesis. And then the last thing, like you saw in that free response question, how do human activities affect these processes and how? So I think if with each of these cycles, you can always answer these 3 questions, you will be more than prepared with this particular part of the course. Okay, so all cycles have a few things in common. So you want to remember that all of the cycles we'll talk about have short-term and long-term storage. So usually when we think about things in living things, that's a short-term thing. So I think a few of you guys mentioned in your question the carbon dioxide that comes from respiration as possibly driving climate change. Remember, that's a short-term thing. So things like CO2 from respiration isn't going to be what drives a change so much as release from long-term storage. Biological processes and physical process. Photosynthesis is a biological process, but erosion by water or wind or some kind of chemical erosion, that's a physical process. And then there's typically a terrestrial and aquatic location, and most of them have an atmospheric one. There's really only one cycle that doesn't. So many of these nutrients are found in rock on land, but as water and wind and everything else erode them, they wash down into aquatic biomes. So let's look at the carbon cycle. I'm going to be mostly talking about this from a human impact point, but if you are studying for the AP exam, I would highly recommend going back and looking at each one of these cycle diagrams until you can kind of like see it in your mind. Okay, so these are sort of our natural pathways, right? So carbon goes from biological respiration from organisms into the atmosphere, but then it goes back again through photosynthesis, right? So that's kind of like a continuous cycle. It's pretty much in equilibrium. The same thing happens with diffusion in and out of aquatic systems. Carbon dioxide goes into the ocean, but then it kind of comes out at equilibrium, right? Where we get into the human aspect of impacting the carbon cycle, it's going to be mostly with burning fossil fuels, releasing it from long-term storage here, things like deforestation, and then of course, human-caused forest fires, like the ones that happened very recently last year. So these things greatly increase the amount of CO2, which is more than what is typically being cycled back and forth between those biological processes. So I really want to make a fine point on this because when we read for the AP exam, students a lot of the times will talk about CO2 from breathing as being an issue environmentally. And I just want to really emphasize those things are roughly equivalent. It can't contribute to climate change because as we're sort of like breaking down food, releasing carbon dioxide in water, producers are incorporating that CO2 back in as glucose. So really that's kind of, a pretty equivalent circle there. It's only really when we either completely destroy a bunch of producers like deforestation, or we pump out a bunch of long-term stored carbon dioxide in the form of fossil fuels that we have a disequilibrium of the amount of CO2. So what are the questions you need to be able to say or answer? Carbon is needed for organic molecules. You need it for glucose, proteins, DNA, all of those like biomolecules you probably learned about in biology. For the organisms and their major interaction here, producers fix carbon, and then every living thing releases it from respiration. So it's really important here that we have a lot of primary producers to absorb this carbon, produce biomass. And what are the human activities? Burning fossil fuels, deforestation, and even our agricultural practices like raising livestock increases the amount of CO2. So the phosphorus cycle. The most important thing that will happen here for human impact is, of course, our use of phosphates. Remember I talked about limiting factors? That abiotic factors are typically limiting, meaning that a plant or algae or bacteria that's a producer cannot grow past the amount of this one limiting nutrient. Phosphorus and nitrogen are big limiting factors when it comes to productivity. And that is why we mine them to turn them into fertilizers so that we can have these small amounts of land that produce huge amounts of food. Well, the problem happens when you get runoff of these phosphates that then enter aquatic systems and throw the nutrient balance off. So that's something we'll kind of get into later. So that's one from just using phosphates for agriculture. The other problem usually comes with livestock. Okay, sometimes human waste, but typically, especially in the developing world, it's raising livestock for chickens, pigs, cows, things like that. So the phosphates that are present in their waste is often kept in these like retention ponds here. And if it rains or if they overflow, then it can flow out into these aquatic systems. The other aspect to remember here about phosphorus, there is no atmospheric component. This is also the slowest cycle. All right, so what do we need to know? Phosphorus, you need it because it makes up things like ATP, phospholipids, your DNA. Producers can assimilate phosphorus, and then we get our phosphate by consuming those producers. Big human impacts, runoff from fertilizers, animal or human waste, that causes those aquatic disruptions to ecosystems. We call that eutrophication. You probably learned about that in the unit about aquatic pollution. So the nitrogen cycle. This has got a lot of different things that are important with human impacts. So two things here. Of course, our fertilizer that we kind of talked about with phosphorus, but then also our nitrogen oxides from burning fossil fuels or even the production of inorganic fertilizers. So if you guys talked about that acid rain, that's part of the increase in nitrogen in the atmosphere. Now, there's a very natural release of nitrogen in the air from volcanic activity. But typically when we see issues, it's from the human impacts there. Now, one thing I will say that if it were me, I would go back and of all the cycles to learn like the actual like processes, it would be this one. This is huge. So you have got to know like what these microorganisms are doing. So denitrifying bacteria, nitrogen fixation by bacteria, because a lot of the questions on the exam will show you this diagram and then maybe have you fill in the blank. So, hey, what would go here? Like if they had this blank, would you be able to know that it's bacteria that takes this ammonia and turns it into nitrate? So make sure you definitely check this back out when you're studying later. So this is why I'm showing you this close up here. For atmospheric nitrogen, that's the largest reservoir. First, in order for it to become available for the biosphere, you have to have nitrogen fixing bacteria. And typically when we want to increase nitrogen naturally in agriculture, we want to choose crops that already have this symbiotic bacteria living there. So that's usually like legumes. So that's why people plant soybeans a lot. It really nitrifies the soil and makes it easier to grow things later. So this nitrogen fixing bacteria is really important there. Then you have things like nitrifying bacteria that takes ammonium and makes it into nitrates. You also have nitrites being turned into nitrates. And then you even have bacteria here that take these compounds and make atmospheric nitrogen out of them. So the thing that the nitrogen cycle biologically relies on are bacteria, microorganisms. Very important. So what do we got to be able to answer here? Well, we got to have nitrogen because it's found in things like proteins and nucleic acids. Again, bacteria are the most important organisms within the cycle. They basically allow nitrogen to be available to producers and then consumers. The way that humans alter the activities here are from nitrogen oxides from fuel combustion and then nitrate runoff from agriculture. All right, last one, but I think you guys probably know a lot about the water cycle already. So I want to go ahead and move on to this one question. And then if we need to, we'll kind of come back to it. So this is showing the hydrologic cycle or the water cycle. So of the labeled places, A, B, C, and D, which do you think is going to be most affected by impervious surfaces, meaning surfaces that cannot, that doesn't allow water to seep through it? All right, I think we're mostly thinking about either C or D, maybe. Yeah, okay. Yeah, those really are going to be the areas mostly that are going to be affected by humans putting a bunch of pavement or asphalt or other impervious surfaces. So let's talk about what these processes really are here. So A, of course, this is rainfall, right? This is precipitation. This right here, this is evaporation, of course. Now, there are things that humans do that change that, but in this case, that's not anything to do with infiltration, right? Okay, so here you've got precipitation hitting the ground, and then you've got it like running off here, right? And so if you had a surface paving this entire thing that had no ability to allow any of this water in, then what's going to happen? There's not going to be any water here. It's just going to erode and fast flow down into this body of water. So I think if you said C or D, that's correct here. But really it's kind of this first part here that's most important. All right. So which part of the hydrologic cycle do you think is most closely linked to the phosphorus cycle? Oh, I'm sorry. Let me actually change it for you guys. All right, so it looks like we've got some definitely differing opinions here. So let's talk about each one of these things. I think B and C are kind of the most popular here. So let's focus on B first. B is, of course, evaporation. So we could say that like maybe as water is being heated up, it's being like dissolved back into the atmosphere. Maybe that there's this gaseous component. But remember, phosphorus is the only cycle here that does not have an atmospheric component. So what we're really going to be looking for is what's happening to phosphorus that's locked into rock. And that's going to be this right here, right? Or even D. I think D or C really works. So as rainfall hits this rock that has a lot of phosphorus stored in it, it's going to weather it and wash it away. And that is how phosphorus gets back into aquatic systems naturally. Now, if you can imagine, if I had a farm here and I wanted to grow crops, right? So here's my, crops, or maybe I've got like forestry going on, and I've been putting a whole bunch of phosphorus on here. Well, as soon as the water lands, it's going to wash off into the aquatic body. And remember, that's going to greatly impact the aquatic ecosystem. Okay, so water, there's not really a biomolecule that it's, incorporated in. It is just important for all metabolic processes. It also is going to be important when it comes to things like temperature regulation for both organisms and just the environment in general. And the amount of precipitation and evaporation, remember, that's one of the abiotic factors that helps to determine biome distribution. So it's pretty huge. Typically, when we talk about human activities, that's going to be runoff, decreased infiltration because we've paved a bunch of surfaces. We built a parking lot, we made a road, or the fact that when we take out forest, we have deforestation. That affects the ability of trees here, right? So the land to actually have moisture go back into the atmosphere. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about energy really quickly, and then we're going to have a little bit of a break. I know you guys have been sitting for like an hour now. So just remember that when we talked about energy cycling through the ecosystem here, we typically in apes use a very specific unit to talk about this. This is kilocalories per meter square. And if we're talking about over time, it's per year. So this is a question that was on the AP exam about primary productivity of a wetland ecosystem. And they said the net annual, so per year, is 8,000 kilocalories per meter square. Now, if respiration is 12,000, what is the gross annual primary productivity in kilocalories per meter square? So up here, I've got the equation for you guys. So gross primary productivity, that's the total rate of photosynthesis, right? That is what we're trying to figure out. And then you've got the amount of respiration here, okay? That's the rate of energy used by photosynthesizers for their own metabolic needs. Well, that's what we've been given here, right? Respiration is 12,000. And so we know the net. The net was this 8,000 kilocalories per meter squared. So if you kind of do the math based off of this, what should be the gross primary productivity? All right, so definitely not C, right? Like C is out of the question. No, no, no. So let's kind of just set this up in a very, simple kind of formula way, right? All right, so we know we were told that the net was the 8,000, right? And then we were also told that the that the respiration was 12,000, right? So what we're needing to know is this right here. So if I wanted to kind of solve this to figure it out, I would want to add 12,000 to both sides, right? So if you do that, that gives you 20,000. So if you remember, gross primary productivity, that's it. That is everything. That's all of the energy available in the system. But then you've got the own producer's metabolic needs that you got to take away, and then everything else gets the net. So let's look at some areas where we have really high productivity. Generally, rainforests, huge amounts of productivity. Wetlands are very, very important. So when we look at the average net primary productivity, here we go, wetlands, swamps, marshes, huge considering how small of a percent they make up on Earth. Open ocean, now it's about 65% of Earth, but productivity is kind of low, but it's so huge. So that's why it makes up about, 25% here. Now, how does this relate back to the way that energy travels through biological systems? Well, you got to remember a couple of things: trophic structure, food chains, and that 10% rule. Now, here we know that energy travels from producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, all the way up, right? But notice most of the time these food chains are ending here. Well, why is that? Well, you've got like 1,000,000 joules of sunlight here, but what is happening at each stage of energy transfer? We're losing heat. It's not moving up. It's waste. It's entropy, right? So once you get to about the third or fourth exchange, there's very little left of the useful biomass. So that's typically why we see food chains only having about 3, 4, maybe 5 links. All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and let us go to, let's see if I can find it here, because I know you guys have been kind of sitting for a while, and we'll pick back up with this. I'm going to give you guys like about a 5-minute break. So it's 3:02 right now. Let's come back in at 3:07. You don't have to leave the Zoom or anything. Just run to the restroom if you need to, grab some water, and we'll pick back up 3:07. All right, guys, we're back. So hopefully you're able to grab a drink, take a little bit of a break, and stretch. Okay, so we were talking about the importance of energy flow through trophic structures and food chains, 10% rule. So this is really important for understanding why we've got a limited amount of energy transfer through all of these food chains. Now, as far as the exam goes, there have been several years where on the free response, you had to either build a food chain, identify different levels within a food web. You had to explain how the laws of thermodynamics relate back to trophic structures and food chains. So that's why this is really important here. This 10% rule, this is all the second law. So as energy is converted to one form or the other, it's never 100% efficient. And generally, it's about 90% inefficient when it comes to movement through trophic structure. That's why we call it the 10% rule. Roughly 10% of what the primary producers make moves to the consumers, and then roughly 10% of that moves to the consumers. So I mentioned migration earlier with seasonal change and Earth's axis and tilt. Well, one of the things that drives migration is oftentimes this idea of primary productivity. So the migratory routes of the blue whale here is often important when it comes to feeding grounds versus their breeding grounds. So they will move where they are able to either have less competition for food or where there's a little bit more productivity. And then they'll kind of move towards a warmer area here where it's a little bit more conducive for having young. So wildlife often engages in either short or long-term migration for a variety of reasons. Primary productivity and food availability is really important, but this also comes back when we will start talking about natural disruptions. All right, so a little bit of practice here. This is exactly what I was talking about with the AP exam. So really quick, from this food web, can you identify a primary producer, primary consumer, and a secondary consumer? All right, yeah, excellent. Everybody's getting the primary producer, definitely the diatom or phytoplankton. Yeah, everybody's getting the primary consumer, that's the krill or the zooplankton. Yeah, and it looks like we've got a couple of choices there when it comes to the secondary consumer. So let's see what you would have gotten points for here. The primary producer, definitely the diatoms here. They're photosynthetic, that's why they're called phytoplankton, and they provide the basis for this food web and all of the chains within it in this Arctic ecosystem. So the primary consumer, that's the krill or the zooplankton. And then for a secondary consumer, you could have said cod or the seal. So that's this and this. Now, if you were asked if there was a tertiary consumer, that would either be the polar bear or the orca. And interestingly enough, the orca can possibly be a quaternary consumer, right? Because you've got diatom, krill, ring-sealed, polar bear, orca, right? So that's a lot of links in that chain. Now, one other thing I'll say about this question is that on the exam, they wanted you to fill in your answers into a table. That is something that's a little recent, where they've been including fillable tables on the exam. So if you see that, don't let it throw you off. You are absolutely encouraged to just put your answer in the blanks provided for you. Okay, so a couple more here on this practice. Other than showing which organisms are consumed, describe what is indicated by the direction of the arrows. And then many species, including whales and birds, they travel long distances. Why do they do that? All right, excellent. Talking about the flow of energy, perfect. So definitely remember in the question, it says like other than showing which organisms are consumed. So they want the kind of really, I guess, primary reason we have those arrows there. All right, couple of more seconds. All right, this is looking good, guys. All right, so let's look at the answers that you, or answers that would have given you points here. So 1 point for a correct reason why a species may migrate. Let's kind of look at that first. So a lot of you guys talked about, going to where the food is. So whales may migrate to locations with more food or water, or especially for birds, that's the case for birds is water supply. There's also migration that might happen because there's species that are following migrating prey. So if you've got a herd animal that moves, then you've also got to move if that is your prey. Some folks mentioned more like warmer weather or a better place for breeding. Then you may want to move where there's a more hospitable climate. Birds often do this in the winter. They'll go south, and then in the summer, they'll kind of come back up north. You also talked about the ideal breeding grounds that oftentimes occurs in different locations. Salmon, that's a huge thing. So they come back in from the ocean and all the way up for miles and miles to get back to these breeding grounds upstream. And I mean, that takes a long time. It's very energy intensive. Or maybe they want to go someplace where their offspring is going to be protected from predators. That's kind of what the salmon do here. They leave the ocean because their offspring will be better protected in these small breeding pools than in the huge open ocean. All right, so let's go back to that this question right here. Other than showing organisms being consumed, right? So yes, by having this arrow point this way, we know the krill is eating the diatom. But really what we're looking at here is the movement of energy, right? Sorry. The movement of, let me write that a little bit better. So when you have this arrow here, that means that energy from the diatom is moving to the krill. Krill's energy moving to the seal. Seal's energy moving to the polar bear. And that's that conservation, the first law there. But remember, heat's being lost at every step of that movement. So you would have gotten 1 point for that. All right, so we're kind of shifting away from Unit 1 stuff. We're going to start talking about biodiversity. I'm going to kind of pick up the pace a little bit because I definitely want us to get in everything before you guys are able to have your nice Saturday afternoon. So what is biodiversity? That's the variety of Earth species or the genes they contain or the ecosystems in which they live, and also ecosystem processes. When we're talking about biodiversity, kind of our unit here is on the species level. And if you remember from biology, we define a species as a group of individuals that can mate and produce fertile offspring. So this can't be like a hybrid where the male and female are reproductively capable, but when their offspring are born, they're sterile. That still means that they're different species. Now, we've identified maybe about 2 million species, but there's estimated to be about 10 to 14 total on Earth. So lots and lots to still discover. Now, species exist in populations. That's one of the levels that you guys identified at the beginning of this review. So those vary with time and year. We often describe their distribution by either being clumped, random, or uniform. That typically relates back to their evolutionary history or maybe like their life histories. So for instance, these fish are clumped because they live in schools. These trees are random because they have random pollination and random settling of their seeds and germination, right? Now, later on in Unit 3, we'll talk more about the dynamics of populations, but most importantly, when we talk about biodiversity, we want to remember that individuals in a species do not evolve. So once this little penguin's in the world, it is what it is. Genes are stable. It's the population that's subject to selective pressure. So please don't forget about this idea about the gene pool. So let's talk more about that idea of diversity on multiple levels. So we just talked about species diversity. How many species do we have? Number and abundance. Within each one of these species, we've got genetic diversity. Are all of them clones, or do all of them have a variety of different alleles? Then you've also got this idea of functional diversity. This relates back to those biogeochemical cycles. Are the nutrients in the in habitats and ecosystems, do they have a variety of different sources and things that move them, or is there really just that one thing? And then you've got ecological diversity. Within a given area, is it dominated by one, or could you find multiple different biomes? Like here, obviously at the same latitude, you've got forest, alpine, coniferous, desert, all kinds of different things. So to touch back on an important aspect of this unit, which you'll need to be able to remember kind of throughout the rest of the course, is evolution. So when we're talking about this, we're really talking about biological evolution. So how does the genetic makeup of a population change? And this is important for biodiversity because you could have 1 million individuals in a population, but if they are all genetically similar, then you don't really have as much biodiversity as it seems. So in the gene pool, we're really talking about what kind of alleles do you have and what is their proportion. So alleles, if you remember, are just these variable segments of DNA on a chromosome that code for a slightly different protein product. So we kind of think about it like hair color. Okay, red hair, brown hair, that kind of stuff. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but generally that's what we mean by alleles. Now, with natural selection and evolution, what alleles make some individuals more successful at either survival or reproduction? If there is a habitat where being blending into the environment here, like being a little bit brown so that you are camouflaged against a brown tree bark, that's advantageous. That allows you to go unnoticed by this prey. And then all of these guys who are a little bit more flashy are eaten. So they kind of have their genes disappear from the gene pool, but your genes stay and multiply. And after successive iterations of this, you have a higher percentage of that particular allele in the population. So this is basically what we say. Individuals who have inherited traits that give them a better chance of surviving and reproducing, they're going to leave more offspring. And because of this unequal ability, there's going to be an accumulation of favorable traits. This is typically why when we go into environments, we see a high fit, all right? So maybe our fitness or like survival of the fitness or survival of the fittest. They are very fit to their environment. It's like they were kind of made to be there. Now, when we talk about interactions here in a minute, this is often due to coevolution. So you can see here that this flower and its pollinator, a butterfly, seem to really fit with each other kind of physically in a way that allows this butterfly to be optimal for spreading the pollen here and helping with this pollination. This cactus flower is really optimally designed in order to be pollinated by this bat. And that's because as one species change, they exert that pressure on the other for it to change in response. So owls become better at hunting mice. You know, certain prey have traits that allow them to escape. And so it's kind of like an arms race over and over again. Some predators have better eyesight. They're more successful hunters, and they pass this to their offspring. Maybe some of these prey are better at running, and so they pass those genes on to offspring. So there's this exertion of selective pressure on both sides here. So let's talk a little bit more about these different relationships here. You probably are familiar with this. So we've got some symbiotic relationships or symbiotic interactions here, and there's three typically that you need to know about. That's commensalism, mutualism, and parasitism. So in commensalism, you know, species A, they get something good from the relationship, but it doesn't really do anything bad or good for species B. A mutualistic interaction, both get something good, and of course, parasitism is when you've got a benefit to one but with a harm in the other. So if we're looking at these pictures, which one do you think exemplifies a commensalistic relationship? Is it this wasp that's laying eggs in this caterpillar? Is it this bromeliad that's kind of just hanging out on this tree limb? Or is it this cleaner shrimp that is getting a little bit of detritus out of this eel's mouth? Yeah, so most of you guys are thinking that it's the bromeliad. So let's look at the other two options and talk about why that is commensalistic or more likely to be so. So of course, this wasp is benefiting hugely by having this host for its eggs. Eggs are going to be laid in the caterpillar. They're going to hatch and then they're going to eat the caterpillar. That's going to really help this wasp's offspring survive. Not great for the caterpillar though. So you've got that benefit of one and then the harm. So this definitely is parasitism. And in fact, we call these parasitic wasps, but they're great for natural pest control. Now here, this little shrimp guy, he's getting a benefit, right? He's getting to eat, and this eel is possibly being cleaned from microorganisms or other things that could potentially make it sick. So they're both sort of benefiting here. That's definitely mutualistic. Now, this one was the correct answer. This was the bromeliad. The tree here, it's neither here nor there. It's not being hurt. It's not being helped, But the bromeliad gets this great location, high up, gets good sunlight, probably gets some moisture from the evaporation of the trees, rain when it rains. So this is a great thing for the bromeliad, but it doesn't really do anything to the tree. Now, competition is another type of interaction that greatly shapes the evolutionary history of species. So sometimes you have competition between different, that's interspecific. So for instance, this lion is in direct competition for the same food as these hyenas, but you also can have competition between members of the same species. So for instance, these two rams are having this competitive display, probably in order to access mates. So if you can imagine, the more stronger or dominant or more successful ram, in this case, maybe with the bigger horns or the tougher skull, is going to be able to mate more often than the one that isn't. So over time, what happens? You get more of these alleles in the next environment. Now, what you will have to know as far as specific terms on the AP exam that result from these types of species interaction is competitive exclusion and resource partitioning. We talked a little bit about this when I mentioned niches earlier. So I really want to give you a good definition of each and then an example so that you don't kind of confuse them, because again, these are two terms that it's hard to know exactly what the difference is. So when we talk about competitive exclusion, this means that two species cannot have exactly the same niche. They can't. If you remember our warblers, they're very close, but they're never in the same exact place. And typically, what's going to happen is if there is that competition, there's going to be a more efficient species, and that species will exclude the other. Now, it does not support the coexisting of competing species. A good example of this is this little lab experiment where you've got two paramecium cultures. When you culture them separately, meaning they're in their own little environments, they both do well. They grow, they stay stable, whatever. But if you combine them, there is clearly a winner here. P. caudatum does not thrive when it's in competition with P. aurelia. Now, resource partitioning is kind of the outcome of competitive exclusion. If there's been competitive exclusion, now we've got resource partitioning. That's the division of the niche to avoid this competition. That's what those warblers were doing. They were like, well, we can't all, have this entire tree. We're going to be in direct competition. So let's space it out. I'll be at the top. You be kind of in the bottom. I'll be in the middle. So this can be spatial or this can be temporal. This is oftentimes why we also see flowers that bloom early spring and then some a little later and then some a little later. That means that they're not in direct competition for the same pollinators. Now, this does help species to coexist because it creates less direct competition. A good example of this is this tidal ecosystem where you've got many different avian species here, aquatic birds, but they don't necessarily have to compete for the exact same food. The plovers, which was on the AP exam a couple of years ago, they stay up towards more of the sandy area. They've got these short beaks. Ducks, they might be in these more shallower areas. They can dive down. And long-limbed things like flamingos or cranes or herons, they do well in deeper water. So they avoid competition here by dividing the resources. One kind of competitive, important dynamic are predator and prey cycles. So again, I don't oftentimes say, memorize things, but this kind of graph comes up almost every exam. So if it were me, I would be able to really even maybe draw this from memory. So one important thing about predator-prey cycles, notice the levels of prey are always higher than the peak levels of the predators. And that makes sense. Remember, you got to have more prey to sustain a smaller number of predators because of the second law of thermodynamics. The other thing that you will notice about this graph is that peaks in population are followed by peaks in the predator population. Then you have a bust followed by a bust. Now, if you remember, maybe you took bio, this is an example of a negative feedback loop. If you have many, many prey, then the wolves in this case are eating really well. They're able to find plenty of food. Well, then their population booms, but then they quickly outstrip their resource. They eat all the prey. And so the population of the prey plummets. Well, that's going to have a reverberating bust on the predator side. If you remember maybe talking about the trophic cascade hypothesis, or maybe top-down regulation, that's what this is. A change in the predator has a direct change on the prey level, and then so on and so forth, and it's kind of a cyclical thing here. Okay, so let's try another practice question that was on an exam recently. All right, I think we're mostly thinking it's got to be those hawks and snakes. So let's kind of see. That is correct. So this table can kind of throw you off a little bit at first, but this isn't as difficult as it looks. So in this column, you've got the consumers, and then here is what they're being or is what they're eating in each row. So like shrews eat grasshoppers, hawks eat shrews, and snakes eat shrews. So these hawks, they want shrews, but so do these snakes. So they are definitely in direct competition. But hawks are able to eat snakes, not the other way around. So they're definitely being preyed upon as well. Yeah, looks like we're leaning towards C. So let's check out the answer here. And that is correct. So we know that 5 different species of warblers, this is very similar to what I showed you on that example, they live in the same species of conifer trees. All of the birds migrate during the summer to these forests, but they don't mate with each other. So we definitely know that there's still different species. So the question here is why are they able to have the same habitat? Why can these different warbler species all be in the same tree? Because what we should see is competitive exclusion, right? But if they have resource partitioning, right? Some of them eat this, some of them eat these things, then you can have these species live in the same tree. Now, D, this is competitive exclusion. This is the niche overlap that we were talking about. This is definitely going to increase the competition for those seeds. Okay, so how do we define diversity? Maybe y'all did a lab about this where you looked at maybe species richness or species evenness. So when we talk about richness, we're talking about the number of the different species, but evenness is just the abundance of individuals. So which one do you think in this diagram has more evenness? Yeah, so evenness, remember, that's going to be how many of each individual of the species is in the distribution of total species in the community. All right, yeah, so let's look at each one of these communities. I think most of you guys are thinking it's community one, so let's talk about why that might be. So remember, evenness, this is the abundance of individuals within each. So of species A, 25, B, 25, C, 25. So it's an even distribution, very, very even. Now, the abundance, or sorry, the richness of the species, that's the same. You've got A through D here and A through D in community 2, but the evenness is absolutely different. What we would call species A in this type of community is the dominant species. And that's not always a bad thing. Most ecosystems are characterized by a type of dominant species. For the most part, Alabama forests used to be mostly longleaf pine. That was the dominant tree. Now it's not as dominant as it was. So that's not necessarily a bad thing for biodiversity. This is just one of the metrics that we can use to define it. So if you guys did a lab, you either used the Shannon-Weiner index or maybe the Simpsons. So I typically use the Simpsons biodiversity index, and that gives that measure of species dominance. So it basically is trying to measure, do we have this going on or do we have this? Is it very even, or is there this dominant species in the ecosystem? And basically what it tells us is if I took two individuals drawn at random, what's the chance that they're the same? If it's a really low chance, then I know that the community isn't really dominated by one thing or the other. Why do we need to measure biodiversity? Typically for us and apes, this is in order to direct conservation efforts. So this is a great quote from E.O. Wilson here. You know, if we don't know how many species there are, if we don't know the biological diversity of areas, it's really hard for us to understand what we can do as far as policy and interventions to help protect that biodiversity. You know, we gotta have the information. So that's kind of where the science idea comes from. So I showed you this diagram earlier, and now I want to relate it back to this idea of diversity. So the more diverse the population is genetically, the more ecological tolerance that population will have at any given time. So individuals in a population are somewhat genetic different, and that helps them, the population react to response to shifts in environmental gradients. So again, you have most of the population here that kind of want to exist at this temperature. But with enough genetic diversity, you do have some animals that if the water got warmer or the water that got cool, water got cooler, it wouldn't completely kill off the entire population. So one positive thing about biodiversity is it keeps species from going extinct simply from changes in environmental conditions. Now, when we look at conservation, typically we want to have the greatest impact for sort of like the less energy, the less money that we have. So one thing that we can look at are biodiversity hotspots. Now, where are these found? Typically at latitudes that are conducive to primary productivity. We already talked about that. That's going to be these equatorial zones here. We have high habitat diversity, so coastal areas, mountainous areas, plains, etc. There's lots of productivity. There's been a moderate amount. So let me put that right here. You don't want extreme habitat disturbance, but you don't also want it to never have experienced any type of disturbance before. And then oftentimes our oldest terrestrial environments are the most diverse. Simply put, there's been more time for evolution to occur. So when we look at biodiversity hotspots, the equatorial ranges, like I said, are oftentimes very important. For the United States, pretty much all of coastal California, and I know it's hard to see, but all of Hawaii, parts of the rainforest, all of this sort of like Southern Asian Pacific islands, very, very high biodiversity. We really want to try to protect it. So another idea that you'll need to know about for this unit that came from also E.O. Wilson and another scientist, MacArthur, is this idea of island biogeography. So there's going to be two specific things that are important here. How big is the island and how far away from the mainland is it? So two rules here. The bigger the island, the more the biodiversity will likely be there. That's because there's just more room in order for species to not be in competition. Also, the closer the island to the mainland, the greater amount of biodiversity. That's because it's easier for species to get to the island and back. That's that migratory pattern that is going to allow more species to possibly colonize and be successful there. So a small island way far away from the mainland, probably going to have less species. A huge island very close to the mainland, probably going to have a lot. Where you will see this shown on the exam is probably in a diagram that looks like this. Okay, so this is called the island equilibrium curves. So as you have increasing species richness, you're going to have more, you're going to have those larger islands and they're going to be nearby, like I said. With decreasing species richness, far from the mainland, and maybe it's very small. This is also related to something called the species area curve. And that is because as you increase the amount of habitat, you have, again, more resources, so it can support far more species. This is also going to be important when we talk about human impacts. So if we take an area that is 70 meters square, right? And we kind of take most of it, right? So say we've only got 10 left. Well, we used to have almost 30 species. Now we're very close to cutting that in half, right? So the more and more that we take, the more drastic the impact has on species. So where we see this mostly is fragmentation of forest area. So we can also call these like islands on land. So when we take a forested area and we make it into these super small patches, not only do we decrease the area that species have to survive, which then drives down biodiversity, but we also make it more difficult for those individuals that are there to even live. So we call these things edge effects. So if you have a question on the AP exam about, what are some of the impacts of deforestation, like other than climate change, it decreases biodiversity because you've got the species area curve. And it also increases edge effects, which increases exposure to predators and competitors. It also makes it easier for pests to move, which then makes the habitat less conducive to the native species that are there. And it can mess up all those abiotic factors that we talked about. Think about these trees here. These trees used to be insulated by all these other trees. So the wind wasn't as strong, maybe the temperature was more steady. Now they're exposed to environmental extremes. So in the last unit, you will be talking about HIPPO plus C or HIPCO. That's basically a good acronym for you to be able to remember all of the human activities that impact biodiversity. Again, this would be something that I memorize. I would be able to know what's the most important impact on biodiversity. Absolutely habitat destruction, that is number one. But we've also got invasive species, pollution, our own pressures from our growing population, climate change, of course, and then overhunting, overpoaching, overexploitation. So make sure you know what each one of those letters in the acronym stand for. Now, why does this drastically affect species biodiversity? Well, number one, there's a genetic problem. So if you have this really robust, large population, and then all of a sudden a human impact comes along like deforestation or overhunting, we reduce the population down to such a small number that we can't help but eliminate some of those alleles. Well, now we're eliminating genetic diversity. That means that if there is a rebound in the population, you've lost so much of that genetic diversity that you're making even a nice, big, large population more susceptible to changing environmental factors because they're more likely to be genetically the same. That's kind of what happened to the buffalo. All the buffalo we have alive today are actually descended from about 12. So they're not as diverse as they once were. That we call that a population bottleneck. Now, why do we care, right? Well, we've talked about a diverse population better responds to environmental stressors. But there's also some good things that humans want from this, right? If we have an area with high species richness, that tends to be more productive and sustainable. Like, I don't know about you guys, but I like to eat food sometimes. So if we're going to rely on the environment to provide our food, we want to make sure that it's healthy and can respond to the environmental stressors. So basically where you want to connect this is high biodiversity, better ecosystem services. So what do we even mean by that? On the AP exam, there will be guaranteed a time that you have to talk about ecosystem services, either identifying one, talking about what's been impacted by human activity, etc. So there's 4 categories: provisioning, supporting, cultural, and regulating. So to give you an example, let's talk about like mangrove swamps. What would be the ecosystem services that it would give to us? Well, we can use timber for building materials, burning it for fuel. Don't we want to be able to consume food? A lot of our coastal areas are where we get things like mussels, oysters, shrimp, larval forms of fish often breed there. So if we like seafood, we should probably protect these areas. They also have regulating services like protecting inland areas from storm surge. So if we don't want our coastal regions to be flooded, we would want to protect them. Supporting services, that would be maybe habitat for endangered species. Maybe I like to go and watch these birds, or maybe I like to camp in a national forest. And then you've got cultural services. that's sort of like what we want to do as far as our own recreation or aesthetic value. So if you can, think about another type of ecosystem service that maybe where you live provides. Is it provisioning? Is it a supporting, cultural, or regulating service? Yeah, disease regulation is absolutely important. So when we have like monocultures, that really allows some of these pest and plant diseases to spread very, very quickly. Yeah, if we're using some of these things to provide electricity, like if we're using that as fuel to make electricity, that's definitely a provisioning service. Yeah, absolutely. People like to go to nice biodiverse areas. That's a cultural service. We like to go to things like botanical gardens. Why? Well, we enjoy looking at really pretty natural environments. Yeah, these are great. Perfect. I'm glad that you mentioned that, John. So, oftentimes on these free response questions, you could get a point by mentioning that if you keep an area biodiverse or if there's a particular plant or animal that people want to come and see, that actually provides income for that region. So, you can make money through ecotourism. Absolutely. Yeah, those are all really great. Okay, so just a couple of quick things that you can think about. Human activities. Oftentimes on the AP exam, they'll actually give you an example from like something that has happened recently. I don't know if you guys remember the BP oil spill, but that really made some of our fisheries and oyster beds unusable. It also closed down many of the beaches and other coastal areas, so people lost billions of dollars in revenue. Harvey, that hit uh, Houston in 2017, completely flooded the city, destroyed property. And that's basically because of a loss of the wetlands around the area that used to absorb a lot of that rainfall and storm surge. Okay, so I do want to give you guys another practice question here. So this is kind of a new format for a question. So if you have not gotten one of these, definitely try this. This gives you like a passage that you have to read through and you're trying to identify the author's claim. So I'll give you guys a second. All right, guys, you might still kind of be reading your answer choices, but it looks like we're thinking about C or D. So let's see what the answer was. No, it was kind of a long passage to read, but the correct answer was D. So that was, that was good. So y'all all eliminated A and B. So let's look at C and D and really what this passage is talking about. There will be either in the multiple choice, like this question, or in the free response, a time where you have to talk about the author's claim. So I know you might want to kind of avoid these multiple choice questions because they're so long, but at some point you'll have to do this. So what is the claim of the author? So C says, bull trout remained in the estuary system after the dam deconstruction because the disruption had irreversibly altered the river habitat. So we know that that's not quite true because you had a large sediment outflow, but then it returned to the original low levels. So it wasn't quite irreversibly altered, but they're unable to live in the high sediment. And so they migrated to avoid the conditions introduced during the dam deconstruction. So this goes back to what we talked about with sometimes animals migrate because that's their natural history and they do that because they are getting food or breeding. But sometimes they migrate because of disruption, and this was an example of that. All right, so we're kind of running out of time, so I'm gonna get like kind of rapid through this. Basically, natural disruptions are those things that are big changes to ecosystems that just happen because Earth's changed. We're talking about plate tectonics, climate change. Climate change is being driven by human activities now, but look here, there's already been periods of increasing temperatures, decreasing temperatures, increased ice, decreasing ice. So there's plenty of natural things that happen on Earth that can cause climate change. It's just right now it's human impacts and it's happening very rapidly. Again, sea level changes have happened because of this as well. We briefly mentioned the wildfires that happened last fall. So one thing that you will need to look over for Unit 2 is what happens to ecosystems when the disruption stops. So two things you got to know about that. That's ecological succession. There will probably be a diagram or an example of ecological succession on the test. Typically, they're asking you questions about like, what types of species come in first? What are the characteristics of a climax community? But more importantly, you've got to be able to differentiate between primary succession and secondary. Biggest thing here. If you can remember that primary succession starts with no soil, awesome. Some examples here that have been on the test before that they've said are primary succession: retreating glaciers, newly cooled lava, even an abandoned parking lot is considered the starting place for primary succession. Secondary, though, you didn't move the soil. The soil is still there. Shorter amount of time because you skipped the hardest part, which is making soil. So things like flooded lands, a polluted stream, burned forest. Now, some things that are important with ecological change here during succession is whether or not the living system can moderate these disturbances and how fast they can bounce back from being disturbed. So typically a resilient environment is going to be like a grassland. That whole thing could burn down, but the next spring, it's all coming back up. But places that are highly biodiverse, like a rainforest, they are really persistent. They're able to survive a bunch of moderate disturbances. But if this were to be burned or clear cut, it would be very, very hard to reach the climax community again. Okay, so last thing here, keystone species. I mentioned this earlier. That was our otter example. So keystone species, if this keystone species of a shark here were to be overhunted or the water was polluted for some reason and it couldn't live there, that means that everything that is below it, like on the trophic levels, are going to be affected. Soon, this hammerhead shark was overhunted, and that means that its primary prey, this cow-nose ray, there was no checks on its population. So it just started eating everything. And that means that our provisioning services, like a fishery, could completely collapse because now it's being overpreyed upon by this organism, which should have been kept in check by the keystone species. So we call it a keystone species because if you were to take this out of this arch, the keystone, this whole arch would collapse. So kind of keep that in mind. Okay, guys, I know we're kind of at the end here. There's a few more practice questions that I had for you. I had another one of these and a couple of like free response questions. So real quick, just so that you can kind of see this, this would be a question that Unit 2 would be critical for. Asking you, describe characteristics shared by ecosystems that have high biodiversity. What's a naturally occurring factor that could lead to biodiversity loss? And then what are some ecological benefits that greater biodiversity provides? If you review all of Unit 2, not a problem at all in being able to answer these questions. All right, so I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to let you guys, if you would like to unmute or ask a question in the chat. If you want to stay a little bit longer and maybe do one of those practice questions, I am more than willing to do. But if you're about to go, I do want to know if you feel a little bit better about being able to do all of that stuff that we talked about at the very beginning.